Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. Washington has sent warships, submarines, and thousands of Marines into the Caribbean, raising questions about America's intentions towards Venezuela. The Trump administration says it is targeting narco-terrorists linked to Nicolas Maduro's regime, but how accurate is that picture, and what does it mean for regional stability and security? There was already an attack on an alleged drug trafficker's boat that killed 11 people. The State Secretary Marco Rubio explained that the strike was ordered personally by President Donald Trump. And while it would have been possible to stop the boat, the decision was made to destroy it, which raises questions about the legality of such an attack. To unpack the situation, I speak with writer Alejandro Sanchez, president of Second Force Strategies in Washington, D.C., and an analyst specializing in defense, security, and geopolitics across the Americas and beyond. How likely is direct U.S. military action against Venezuela? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Alex, what do we know about the U.S. military buildup around Venezuela? What assets is America sending, and why now? The U.S. military strike has already killed 11 alleged drug traffickers from Venezuela in the Caribbean Sea.
So, just to clarify, I think it would be incorrect to say that the buildup is around Venezuela. Yes, there is a fleet of around 8 U.S. warships and 1 nuclear-powered submarine in the Caribbean, but the U.S. government has not released where exactly these ships are. I'm pretty sure they're not in Venezuelan waters. They're probably in international waters in the Caribbean. So I just want to clarify the locations so people don't think that they're right like off the Venezuelan coast. With that said, according to the U.S. government, there are probably around 8 ships in the Caribbean right now. We're talking about 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, 1 Ticonderoga-class cruiser, 2 transport docks or vessels, and 1 Wasp-class amphibious assault ship, the Iwo Jima, a littoral combat ship, I believe, and the USS Newport News, which is a nuclear-powered attack submarine as well. And there are also some aerial assets that the U.S. hasn't clarified very well what they are. And when we talk about ground assets, it's important to remember that the U.S. doesn't really have many bases in the Caribbean. Across the Greater Caribbean, there's obviously the Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, there's one in Honduras, and one in El Salvador. What is coming out from the administration is that a number of U.S. Marines from the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit have been deployed to Puerto Rico to conduct military training there. Puerto Rico being a Caribbean island, so the terrain, the topography is a little bit similar to the climate is something similar to what we see in Venezuela, just to make a comparison. So we're talking about, according to the U.S., up to like 4,000 troops have been deployed, especially Marines, into Puerto Rico, 8 surface vessels that we know of, 1 submarine, and a determined number of aerial assets.
What do we know about this military strike I have mentioned?
The U.S. government, meaning Washington, the Defense Department, U.S. Sovereign Command, and the U.S. Navy have been very tight-lipped. The strike we only have going on so far for right now is a post by U.S. President Trump and the video. The post, Trump explains that there were 11 terrorists that were part of the Tren de Aragua cartel, which is an important fact to keep in mind. And according to the news outlets, they have the strike happening in the Caribbean. It's unclear if it happened in international waters or in the waters of a specific country, Venezuela or otherwise. From the details I can gather, it probably happened in international waters in the Southern Caribbean. That's point 1. Point 2, the fact that the U.S. administration is saying that not only these individuals were part of the Tren de Aragua cartel, but also that they were taking orders from Nicolas Maduro. I think this is an important link to make. Usually, the U.S. administration has accused the Venezuelan government of supporting of drug cartels. They have accused the Venezuelan government, especially President Maduro, of being the leader of the infamous Cartel de los Soles or Cartel of the Suns. But the link between whether the Venezuelan government actually controls Tren de Aragua cartel, which is a different cartel, is being kind of murky. But the U.S. government is making this link that, yes, somehow Caracas is ordering directly this particular cartel. So I think that's a link that will probably have ramifications in the future and consequences in the near future. As for the airstrike, there haven't been many more other news about it, or at least facts that have been released. For example, we don't know what kind of missile was used to attack this boat. Also, why did the U.S. attack the boat? Did the crew attack the U.S. vessel, for example? Were they given a warning to surrender? And if they did not surrender, that's why they were attacked. So I think there's a lot of questions that are going to come out from this particular incident. But again, the U.S. government is saying that these individuals were not just drug traffickers, they were terrorists, which I guess from a legal point of view probably justifies their strike that was carried out.
In fact, I wanted to ask you about the rhetoric. Basically, those drug traffickers were described by the U.S. government as terrorists. Of course, those drug cartels and members of those drug cartels can be extremely brutal, but still, calling them terrorists, is it useful?
From a legal point of view, it's probably useful, but because it allows the government to carry out certain measures that they could not carry out if you say, oh, they're criminals or they're suspects. Point one. Point two, also it helps to, from a public relations perspective, probably helps the Trump administration because they're saying, oh, these individuals, they were not just criminals, they were like violent terrorists that a person can compare to terrorist organizations from around the world like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, which again justified the action carried out by Washington. But again, look, I'm from Latin America. I cover Latin America and the Caribbean. My region has a past history of internal warfare. And we have qualified and described these individuals differently. There's some that drug traffickers, or they're terrorists, or they're narco-terrorists, or they're insurgents. So for me, terrorist is somebody who is not just committing a crime, has some kind of ideology, either political or maybe extreme or religious. These individuals, I don't know anything about them except that they apparently belong to the Tren de Aragua. So I don't think I will have to describe them as terrorists, but I can see why the U.S. administration will do so to justify the action that they carried out.
Authoritarian Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro says that the U.S. is seeking regime change in his country. How do you assess such a statement?
Venezuela has been covering Venezuela for over a decade already, for like probably a decade and a half. So I think I know a lot of the history of U.S.-Venezuela relations. The Venezuelan government has been a thorn on Washington's side since 1999, when Hugo Chavez came to power. So that's already like 26 years now from Hugo Chavez, who ruled from 1999 to 2013, and Nicolas Maduro, who took power in 2013 when President Chavez passed away, until today. The Venezuelan government continues to have strong relations with governments like Russia, China, Iran, and regionally with countries like Nicaragua and Cuba. All of these governments are opponents, competitors, security challenges for the U.S. The Venezuelan government is also involved in drug trafficking through its territory, and it also threatens its regional neighbor Guyana over the Essequibo region. Over the past decades, the Chavez and Maduro administrations have accused Washington of organizing regime change operations in the country, like coup d'etats, sending mercenaries, drone attacks, and the sort. So for President Maduro to make this claim, given the ongoing major military deployment, is fairly standard and nothing new from somebody who actually researches this particular topic. I certainly do believe that Washington wants to see a more democratic and transparent government in Caracas, a government who respects human rights and good governance. But I don't think it's going to carry out regime change right now. Certainly, the Maduro administration has spun this operation as not just as a national threat, but as a regional threat. For example, in the statement that they have released since the buildup occurred, Maduro has said that the U.S.'s objective was not just regime change, but also that they wanted Venezuelan oil, and gas as well. So they're coming from Venezuela's natural resources. And then he will say, no, but the Venezuelan gas, Venezuelan oil, it doesn't belong to the U.S., the gringos, it belongs to you, to Venezuela. And they will also say that the Venezuelan presidency has also released some statements saying how what's happening right now is one of the biggest threats to the whole continent in the past 100 years. And that threatening Venezuela is threatening the entire continent. So again, what Maduro is trying to do is to, one, gather domestic support from its population, and also try to regionalize the situation, saying, oh, if the US attacks us, it's like if they are attacking Panama or Peru or Argentina or any other country. So it's like we're the first ones and then somebody else will follow. So I think that's how they have been responding. I will add that, no, I don't believe that the US wants to invade Venezuela. I think that Trump, as much as he and pretty much anybody in the US administration would like to see a new government in Venezuela, there's no interest from the US administration to be engaged in another operation, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or Ukraine or Venezuela. The US has no interest, the US government has no interest in invading Venezuela. A la Operation Iraq Freedom. The point is that, yeah, so I don't think there's any interest by the US government to carry out this kind of thing, sending like 4,000 Marines to Maracaibo and then to Caracas. Like what happened in Iraq or Afghanistan, it will be too expensive in terms of lives, hardware, money. It will probably come down to some kind of like guerrilla warfare, like what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, to be honest. So I'm sure the US could militarily defeat the Venezuelan military, at least Navy, can easily defeat the Venezuelan Navy, but carrying out some kind of like long-term operation against the Venezuelan government, in international operation, like boots on the ground, I'm sure the US administration does not want that.
You partly answered my question about the theoretical military operation in Venezuela, because I very much agree that I think it's very unlikely, but you said a few things about this, so can you maybe add a little bit more? If it were to theoretically happen, what shape and scope would this kind of military operation from the US have?
Okay, so as an analyst, you were supposed to daydream a lot, just think out loud, and have like war games. We organize war games in DC sometimes to say like what could happen, and if this happens, then what will be the response by the other side, blah blah. Again, I don't think the United States wants a boots on the ground type of operation. Let me answer like this: the worst thing the Venezuelan government can do is attack the U.S. Navy, the U.S. fleet, because that will give them the excuse to shoot back. As long as the Venezuelan Navy, their speedboats, their patrol vessels, like they remain in the territorial waters, just no moving around, no sailing around, sure, that's fine. But if any of them shoot at a U.S. destroyer, at a U.S. landing platform dock, at a U.S. aircraft, and somebody gets hurt or somebody gets killed, that will, at the very least, justify any kind of retaliation. What will happen? Again, even though I think that there will be boots on the ground, we can see something that was like what has happened against Iran only a few months ago, namely targeted airstrikes. The U.S. can easily, just like we saw in Iran, send either warplanes, send some Tomahawk missiles to specific key locations as a way to punish the Venezuelan government, the Maduro government. And I think that, again, I'm daydreaming a little bit. Maybe what the U.S. administration is hoping for is that, if they can just weaken the Venezuelan government, the Maduro administration just enough, then that can convince the Venezuelan population to stand up, protest, and they can remove Maduro from power. There can be a civilian, overthrow of the Maduro regime. I think that's the best case scenario that the U.S. administration wants to see. Like, at most, target airstrikes, if we're going to think of very, very hypothetically, and then hope that convinces either some general in Caracas to say, you know what, Maduro, you've gone too far. Like, we don't want to get in a war with the U.S. Or you can convince the Venezuelan masses to just stand up and say, you know what, the Venezuelan government looks weak right now. They're getting us into a war that we don't want. Let's really just get rid of Maduro once and for all.
Do you see any signs of possible internal political change in Venezuela?
Unfortunately not. I think the Venezuelan people are tired of Maduro, but they're also tired of protesting. They've been protesting a lot. They've gone to the polls several times, but the Venezuelan government continues to cheat and claims victory in these very undemocratic so-called elections, which I will not call them as elections because they're not. And then when we have seen protests, the Venezuelan government's plan or modus operandi is to just tire the population out, to just have them protest, then they send the police, send the militias, send the armed forces. You have some crackdowns, human rights abuses. Eventually, the population gets tired. They say, okay, this is not going anywhere. Let's just go back home and go back to work and, continually trying to survive. So I forget when are the next Venezuelan elections scheduled for, but I am not hopeful in any way that they're going to be free or fair. And after Maduro's so-called presidential electoral victory last year, I believe. I don't know the status of the Venezuelan opposition and the political parties, what their strategy is right now. Like, do they want to just continue going to the polls and trying to defeat Maduro at the local level, at the state level, instead not the presidential level? I'm not really sure what the strategy is, but I will be very shocked if they are optimistic right now because the situation continues to get worse for them.
The U.S. offers $50 million reward for the arrest of Maduro, and the Trump administration described the Venezuelan president as the head of the Cartel de los Soles. Can we say how real is this Cartel of the Suns? Because some analysts are somehow doubting that it's really that important.
Drug trafficking certainly exists in Venezuela. There are several credible reports, of course, and incidents of Venezuelan nationals operating the famous narco speedboats, traveling through the Caribbean, or working for the cartels that operate in Colombia and elsewhere. That part, of course, I do not doubt. The U.S. government believes that the Cartel of the Suns is headed by Nicolás Maduro himself and other high-ranking Venezuelan individuals, and there has been sanctions by the U.S. Department of Treasury, I believe, against them. Anecdotally, just to yesterday, September 2nd, the government of the Dominican Republic also announced sanctions against the Cartel de los Soles, against the Cartel of the Suns. Though I read the resolution, and the resolution does not actually mention Nicolás Maduro by name. It just says we're sanctioning this narco-trafficking organization, but they don't actually say who are the bosses or the leaders. On the other hand, the President Gustavo Petro of Colombia, who has cordial relations with Venezuela and the Venezuelan leader, Nicolás Maduro, tweeted just last week that the Cartel of the Suns does not exist. I will say that I am not sure if President Maduro himself is the head of a drug trafficking organization called the Cartel of the Suns. But at the very least, he's certainly guilty of tolerating the existence and operations of drug cartels in Venezuela. And there is no doubt in my mind that there are elements within his government and the armed forces of Venezuela that collude with the drug cartels and other criminal elements. So, to answer your question, the Cartel of the Suns is a name that has been attributed to Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro for 3 decades. I have friends in Colombia, for example, who really believe that the Cartel of the Suns exists. I know other analysts who are more ambivalent and say like, oh, is Maduro himself really in charge of this cartel? I am still on the fence, but that does not mean that other drug cartels don't operate in Venezuela with impunity, with a lot of liberty, under the, if not control, at least support of the Venezuelan government. We know that Colombian narco-insurgents like the FARC, for example, operate in Venezuelan territory, and from Venezuela they launch attacks against Colombian armed forces in Colombia. So they just cross the border back and forth. So at the very least, the Venezuelan government is guilty of giving safe haven to many of these terrorist, narco-insurgent, criminal, drug trafficking organizations. So of that, they are certainly guilty.
I want to challenge something you said in one of your answers, and you said that Washington would like to see more democratic and transparent government in Venezuela. In a way, yes, and now I don't want to sound as a Maduro's advocate because I'm not one, absolutely not. But on the other hand, frankly speaking, when I see how President Trump is acting towards other countries, I somehow doubt that his position is to see a more transparent and democratic government in Venezuela. I will make it very simplistic, but I would say that he would be absolutely satisfied with having somebody like El Salvadorian President Bukele in Venezuela, the similar figure. So how do you see that? Do you think that Trump is really seeking a democratization of Venezuela, or he would be satisfied with having Venezuela on his side no matter of the regime?
At the very least, I think the U.S. government wants to have allies and partners across Latin America and the Caribbean. So looking at the history of U.S.-Latin America relations, going back to the Cold War, during the Cold War region, especially when we had so many coups, military coups, and we had dictatorships like Pinochet dictatorship in Chile, for example, or the terrible juntas that governed Central America in the 80s and the 70s, and who were pro-U.S., by the way, but they carried out horrible human rights abuses. Yeah, I have to acknowledge that, yes, I'm sure there are some individuals in the U.S. government that will say, if we can just have an ally in Venezuela, even if that person carries out human rights abuses, but they're friendly with us and they support us and they're against Iran and Russia and China, we're happy with that. At the same time, I also know enough people that work for the U.S. military, for the U.S. government, that actually believe in human rights. They actually want good governance. They actually want fair and transparent rule, and they want that for Venezuela. So to simply say everybody in Washington wants this kind of government in Venezuela, and everybody in Washington wants all kind of government in Venezuela, I think that would be very simplistic of me. I would say there's a split. Certainly some people, they Cold War era hawks, they see either you're a U.S. ally or you were our enemy. They'll say, if Maduro became an amazing power, but he becomes our friend, then we're okay with him staying in power. And there are all people that will simply say, you know what, no, he's a terrible leader and he has to be removed just because of basic human decency.
And maybe to wrap up our conversation or debate, in general, is there some evidence that the threat of the U.S. military intervention, for example, also in Mexico, is affecting how some countries in Latin America deal with the criminal groups, with drug cartels?
I know this is a podcast, so I think if you made a YouTube video, we could have like a map of Latin America and the Caribbean. I can go like country by country and say like, well, this is how this behaves and this is how this other country behaves. That'll be much easier. But since it's a podcast, it's just audio, I think it's a little bit more challenging. I would say that foreign policies and geopolitics have a role to play. And there are some countries that actually are taking a tougher stance against their own criminal elements, but not because they feel threatened by the U.S., but because they want greater U.S. help. For example, Ecuador is a great example of it. President Daniel Noboa would actually really like more U.S. military assistance. He has even been pushing for a constitutional reform so that the U.S. military can actually open up a new base in Ecuador to help with Ecuador's internal security challenges. Then you have Bukele, obviously, in El Salvador. He, of course, will love more U.S. military assistance. So for these two leaders, there's no threat in their minds. They actually want more U.S. aid. There are other countries in which it's almost business as usual for their armed forces and their law enforcement agencies. I'm talking about Peru, Paraguay, Colombia, Brazil. I read about it on a daily basis. I talk to defense officials. Their operations to crack down on illegal mining, illegal fishing, drug trafficking, narco-insurgents, gangs, smugglers happens on a daily basis. It doesn't really threats from the U.S. hasn't really affected their operations because they're just going ongoing no matter what. Just in the past for like 2 or 3 weeks, there were these horrible attacks in Colombia. There was a police helicopter that exploded in, I believe, Antioquia. 13 police officers were killed. There were some IDs, some bombs that exploded in, I believe, Cali, which is a city in Colombia. It was close to a Colombian Air Force base. 6 civilians were killed, I think even a pregnant woman, if I'm not mistaken. And that has prompted a huge military operation by the Colombian military, Colombian police to crack down on these elements. So these armed forces, these governments have no problem in their operations. They don't feel the threat by Washington because they're doing what they can. And they're doing all that what they can. I will say that there's one exception, and that kind of goes to your point, which would be Panama. In the past few weeks, in the past few months, I've noticed that Panama security forces, namely Aeronaval and Senafront, which is the border police, have increased, in my opinion, their operations to crack down on undocumented migrants, smugglers, and drug trafficking in areas at the Darien, which is the border between Panama and Colombia. Is that a response to the statements by the White House, by the State Department about Panama, a potential U.S. military presence in Panama, and the ownership of the Panama Canal? Somebody can make that connection. I'll leave it at that. But there are a couple of governments, at least Ecuador and Colombia and El Salvador, which they would certainly like more U.S. military assistance for their own security challenges. For other countries, especially in South America, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Paraguay, it's business as usual. The threats don't really have affected them. Panama, I think, may be an exception to the rule.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.